Okay, hello. Today we're going to talk about the disability rights movement and do a brief overview of it. As being members of Best Buddies, it's really important to know a little bit about the history of the disability rights movement and know how this work's been going in the past and where it's headed in the future. So we will get started with a brief overview of the history. So people with disabilities have always existed and they've always been crucial parts of our society, even though many times our history books or the things we learn in school might not always mention them. They've always existed and they've always been part of this movement. The disability rights movement officially kicked off, led by people with disabilities in the 1800s. The early 1900s was a sad period of institutionalization, where people with disabilities were often forced against their will into different institutions. There's a lot of discrimination and sterilization of people with disabilities. The late 1900s, we started to see a lot of progress in disability activism and revolution. So a lot of great progress there, which helped lead to where we are today in the 2000s, where there is a widespread acceptance of neurodiversity. Although there's been a lot of great work that's been done, it's really important to acknowledge that the work isn't done and activism is going to continue until everyone is fully equal. So in the 1800s, we meet Dorothea Dix, who saw the mistreatment of people with intellectual disabilities in hospitals and institutions. And she put together a report in the 1840s that talked about this mistreatment and called it out. Although her intentions with this report were good to lead to change, it ended up leading to the development of more institutions for the disabled. And these institutions are often underfunded and stigmatized, which ended up causing a lot more harm to these people than good. And so we continue seeing this trend throughout the 1800s where disabled people are excluded from the workforce. A lot of times, people with physical disabilities were included in the circuses and freak shows. So we can see here kind of where the stigma starts of people with disabilities not being seen as equals and not being seen as the human beings that they are. And so in 1883, we see the start of the eugenics movement. This is a whole big movement that talks about basically the passing on of desirable traits. And so certain people decided what traits they thought were desirable to pass on. And that kind of framed a mindset around who should be able to have kids, who should be able to reproduce, and who shouldn't be. Unfortunately, people with disabilities were seen as people who shouldn't be able to have kids, as there's so much stigma around disabilities. That type of mindset continues into the 1900s. But in the 1900s, we also see a lot of small scale disability activist groups start forming. So there's a lot of great work already underway here. And in 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected the president. He was the first US president with a visible disability. He was in a wheelchair most of the time, but he often tried to hide this from the public view. If you look it up on Google, there's a lot of like images that kind of show how he tried to control his image so that it didn't look like he was in a wheelchair. And this is all due to stigma. People often saw people with disabilities as inferior or incapable of doing the tasks that people without disabilities could do. And although it was a great step in progress that Franklin Roosevelt was elected president as someone who had a disability, it was also sad that he had to hide it because of the stigma. In 1935, the League of the Physically Handicapped forms in New York City, and they put on a lot of protests about work discrimination. And as a result of their hard work, 1,500 jobs were created in the city for people with disabilities. So this is a huge leap of progress that we're seeing. In the 1940s, this period is marked by World War II. And we see here the eugenics movement unfortunately continue and spread worldwide. When we think about Nazi Germany and the idea of desirable traits, we see that certain people were prohibited or prevented forcefully from being able to reproduce or have kids. And so we can see just how harmful this eugenics movement truly is, and World War II is the biggest example of that. And we know that people with disabilities were really harmed during this time. As a result, also, though, of World War II, back here in the United States, a lot of veterans were returning with disabilities. Maybe they were injured in war or whatnot. And so as Americans saw these people as heroes, the view of disability started to change a little bit because they were viewing these people who they viewed as heroes come back to the United States who needed extra support and extra help. And so a lot more resources began to be developed for people with disabilities and especially disabled veterans. Activists are continuing to push for deinstitutionalization and destigmatization about people with disabilities. And we see the civil rights movement take off. And although we talk about the civil rights movement a lot in terms of race, disabled people were also part of this movement and we're also fighting for rights regarding disabilities. A lot more progress gets made towards the late 1900s. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was passed, and this prohibited discrimination in federal programs and services. And so disabled activists led sit-ins and protests to help get this act passed. And this is another big leap of progress for the disabled community because it put into the law the prohibition of discrimination, which is really, really important. 1974, 20 years later, there was a ruling that people cannot be institutionalized against their will. This is also really important because it means people can't be forced into institutions or mental hospitals or different types of institutions. And then also that year, the IDEA Act was passed, and this act allowed for non-discrimination policies in public schools. So making sure that every student has a right to education regardless of any disabilities that they may have. A really big event that was super, super important in this disability rights movement is called the Capitol Crawl. And this happened in March 1990. There was a huge push among different politicians and a lot of disabled activists for the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, to be passed. This act essentially would basically declare everyone equal under the law and help make a lot of things a lot more accessible for people with disabilities. And so one of the huge demonstrations that was that happened to help push for this law to be passed was called the Capitol Crawl. And basically a lot of disabled and non-disabled activists showed up to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and they showed just how inaccessible the stairs out front were. This was a bigger metaphor for their push for making spaces more accessible and making the country more accessible for people with disabilities. And so in this picture here, you can see a disabled activist climbing up the steps and showing just how difficult it is for some people with certain disabilities to do certain things without special accommodations. And so this caught a lot of media attention and ultimately led to the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. In essence, this law prohibits discrimination based on disability in employment, services rendered by state and local governments, places of public accommodation, transportation, and telecommunication services. Businesses were mandated to provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities. Public services could no longer deny services to people with disabilities. They were expected to have modifications to make accessibility more common. And there were mandates for adaptive services for people with disabilities. So essentially, a lot of the accommodations we see today, such as like hallways need to be a certain width so that wheelchairs can get through, or buildings need to have elevators. A lot of this language is found in the ADA, and it's a really great law and act to research and learn more about because it's been so pivotal in this fight for disability rights. A law that you may be familiar with in 2010, Rosa's Law was signed into action by President Obama. Rosa was a little girl who worked with her family to help pass this law because she and her family believe that language matters. And so this law replaced all instances of the R word in any legal proceeding, any law, with terms such as intellectual disability, and also normalize the usage of person first language. And so this law and the act of Rosa and her family helped pave the way for more inclusive language, showing that words matter and showing that the language that we choose shows and makes an impact on how we see and treat other people. And so when we talk about the Spread the Word to End the Word campaign, all of this can kind of come back to Rosa's Law and the passage of this. Activism today is really important. Although, as you have seen through this presentation, we've come an extremely long way in terms of disability activism. There's still so much more work to be done. We need to continue listening to disabled voices in their fight against injustice. The work that we do through Best Buddies is critical to this movement for genuine inclusion. We are helping create more inclusive school environments, a more inclusive work environment, more inclusive society. And this is really, really important work. The dream one day is that Best Buddies won't have to exist because this type of inclusion will be natural for everyone. But until we reach that point, we have to continue working and fighting for a more inclusive society, a society that can accommodate all people and where all people are accepted and valued. And so the work in Best Buddies is really important, but the work in the disability movement as a whole is super important. This activism never stops and it continues.